All right, we have a Minion Plus, and there's a few announcements and housekeeping to do before we officially start. So I'll start with that now. Welcome to session 2 of Approaching a New Year, the environmental, social, and spiritual implications of Shmita. So glad to be exploring with all of you. As those of you who were here last week know, this isn't quite the polished class that I sometimes give. This is sort of a jumble of sources and questions that I'm holding, and I'm really excited to share with all of you and try to come to some clarity. So I appreciate you being willing to be on the journey with me. You probably got a pop-up as you joined saying that this meeting is being recorded. We are planning to post it on YouTube for those who are missing it. If we break out into breakout rooms, those will not be recorded. So at least at one point during this class, I will invite you into breakout rooms so that there's the opportunity to discuss without being recorded. But other than that, consider when you speak, I really want to hear whatever you want to say, and consider whether you want anybody to hear it for posterity ever. I think the chat won't make it onto YouTube. So if you want to make a comment in the chat that isn't attributed to you, I can then share it out loud. What else did I want to say? I'm like really wrestling with Shmita. I feel like there is something very powerful here that I want to understand, that would be helpful for the community to understand. I'm now in like 3 drafts of a Rosh Hashanah sermon about Shmita, and I just can't figure out where it's taking us. So I'm hoping you'll help me with that. And that's my unofficial intro. And the recording, and I think Jody will cut out all of this part, and we'll start the recording now. So friends, welcome to session 2 of our exploration of Shmita. Last week we learned, even though we tried to focus on the environmental implications exclusively, that it is difficult to disentangle the environmental implication from the social implications. So this week we're going to dive more directly into the social implications and sort of going deeper into some of the issues that started to come up last week. So we will start with the same 2 Shmita sources that we engaged with last week in session 1, and then we're going to add another biblical source, and then we're going to go into some commentaries about that. So I mentioned that Shmita is commanded explicitly in Torah 3 times. And last week we looked at 2 of the places where that commandment pops up. But for those who weren't here last week, and because it's good for a refresher, we're going to look at those 2 again before we add the 3rd tonight. So I'm going to share my screen, and we will say the blessing for Torah study. And then we'll go into our study. Carol, I see that you have a hand up. Is that on purpose? Did you want to say something? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lower your hand. Lower your hand. Oh, yes, I do. There you go. It appears you've raised your hand again. Do you want to say something now? Okay, you lowered it yourself. Great. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal and our God, mover of the universe, who sanctifies us with mitzvot and commands us to engage in the study of Torah. And we're going to jump right in. So the first mention of Shmita, who would like to read from Exodus? I can zoom in a little more.
I'll read.
Thank you.
6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed.
Thank you so much for reading, Philip. That audio came in pretty choppy for me. Is that my system problem, or was that coming in for others as well?
Clear for me.
Okay, then it's my problem, and I won't bother
Clear.
again. Great. So thank you for reading, Philip. We have this basic ikar, this basic general principle of Shmita, that the land is not to be worked in the seventh year, and that it is a time for rest and for a sort of opening of access to whatever grows in the land. Let's read source number 2 again, a refresher from last week. I'm sorry, a little bit of a refresher. I didn't include the entirety of this source. Last week we looked at Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 7. Tonight we're looking at just the last 3 verses, which kind of zoom in on the social implications. The first 4 verses talk about letting the land rest, and now verses 5 through 7. Another volunteer to read.
I'm raising my hand.
Great, Carol, thank you. Go ahead.
Do not harvest crops that grow on their own, and do not gather the grapes on your unpruned vines, since it is a year of rest for the land. What grows while the land is resting may be eaten by you, by your male and female slaves, and by the employees and resident hands who live with you. All the crops shall be eaten by the domestic and wild animals that are in your land.
Thank you for reading, Carol. And as some of you may recall, last week we got into a little bit of a question about whether the listing of who gets to eat is meant to be expansive or exclusive, right? Is it all the produce is available to be eaten by anyone, including but not limited to, or is it that all of the produce is available to be eaten only by this group of people? So we can keep that question in mind, because some of the sources we're looking at tonight, I think, will answer it. So we get to the third mention of Shmita in Torah, which shows up in Deuteronomy in Parshat Re'eh. And this doesn't talk about the land at all. This takes Shmita in a direction that might at first seem not intuitively connected to what we have been reading in the previous 2 texts. Can I have a volunteer to read this one?
Sure. At the end of every 7 years, you shall celebrate the remission year. The idea of the remission year is that every creditor shall remit any debt owed by his neighbor and brother when God's remission year comes around. You may collect from the alien, but if you have any claim against your brother for a debt, you must relinquish it. Thus there shall be no needy among you, for God will bless you in the land.
Thank you, Howard, for reading that. And by the way, this is the text that actually brings in the word Shmita, that calls it Shmita. We see the root in the first text, V'hashvi'it tishmetena, and in the 7th year, you shall let it lie fallow. But this same root comes up with Shmita. You shall do a Shmita, which is what they're translating as a remission. And this is the essence of the Shmita. Shamot kol baal maseh yado. Every creditor shall remit what he holds in his hand. So, as you see in the question, I conveniently wrote as a reminder to myself, we're adding this Deuteronomy text that talks about debt and debt release to the conversation. And before we get into any of the commentaries, as interesting as they are, I just invite you to consider the 3 core Bible verses, core Bible excerpts that speak about the Shemitah year and how they are in conversation with each other. Particularly, how does this text from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, impact how we understand the focus and the essence of Shemitah to be? So, in order to take some time for everybody to be able to think that through, I'm going to go ahead and move people into breakout partners to just explore your thoughts about this. And then if any of you have thoughts that you want to share when we come back to our recorded session, you're welcome to, but this is a time to say things that you don't have to worry about being recorded for posterity. So give me a moment to go ahead into the breakout rooms. And again, if you want to refer to the texts, you should be able to find them at this link in the chat, even when I'm not sharing screen. And I'm going to take a moment to create the breakout room. And you should all have an invitation to join a breakout room. I'll give you about 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. All right, friends, welcome back, and much love and empathy to those of you who are coming back cut off mid-sentence. Feel free to private chat the person you were talking to at the end of your thought and give them a thank you. So what do we make of this? Does anyone want to share what we make of this edition of the text from Deuteronomy 15? Questions or insights that it raises for you, or objections? Go ahead, Carol.
I commented that it's one thing to leave your field fallow, but it's like, no, boy, now you're going to get to my money. And Marjorie was commented that maybe after 7 years, it's time to let go of the debt anyway. But to me, it's got a whole different dimension that it's coming out, that you have to forgive debts. You're moving into a whole new realm, a financial realm.
Right. Okay, I see lots of hands. Thank you, Howard. And then Philip. Howard, you're muted.
Thank you. I think what I was talking to Debbie about was, I thought that in some ways, the 3 readings, and I'm doing this cold, seem to narrow rather than expand. The Exodus seemed to be wide open for interpretation. Anybody. It didn't even say that the people who own the vineyards could take any food from it, that it was open to anyone who wanted to come, others who wanted to come. It was actually others, and wild beasts and domestic animals. And then the second one seemed to narrow it down to household, slaves, servants, people who live on the farm or whatever it would be, and animals, domestic and wild. And the third one, which deals with another form of currency, hear debt, and we don't know what debt means. It could be chickens, for all we know. So it could have the same to do with, or grapes. But this is so that we have no needy in the community. We remit the debts, but only for Israelites or Jews, I guess we can say now. But there will be aliens who will be destitute, and that's okay. Now, I understand this, and I don't say this, I understand that this is how communities are made, but it seemed to narrow in the three readings to me, the scope.
Right. Although I did deliberately not include that verse, but you brought your prior knowledge of that verse.
Oh.
Well done. Well done, Howard.
Sorry.
No need to apologize. It's good. We're bringing our knowledge. Yes. So, well, it's very clear. It's very clear in the Exodus and Leviticus text that notwithstanding the limitations on the debt annulment, the land of Shmita is available for harvest by anyone passing through.
Yeah.
But it does, but yes, the debt forgiveness program is only for within the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, and like to this day, there are Hebrew free loan societies that are for Jews making loans to other Jews. And they don't make loans outside of the community. So there's a whole ancillary question we can have about the morality of mutual aid that is based on affinity, which I think we all do in various ways, but sometimes we're conditioned to think there's something wrong with that. And we've talked about this in Torah stuff.
Yes.
So Philip, and then I see that Sophia has her hand up as well.
Ellen wanted me to talk, and I'm going to sort of do it backwards, and that is looking at what the agricultural and the financial things look like together. And that is, if you're poor, you get to forage during this year. You get to you get to go out and eat things on this land, and your debts are forgiven. On the other hand, if you're well-to-do, you don't get to harvest your own crops. And you've got to forgive all the money that's owed to you, and that the result is that the whole society, if everybody is doing it, the whole society is equalized a bit. And part of the reason that seems so interesting to me is I remember I was blown away by a lecture that some historian was given, who made the case that every civilization that's disintegrated has disintegrated at the point that the gulf between rich and poor gets greater and greater and greater. And here we have in the Shmita idea a way of the whole society equalizing a little bit every 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
Without attempting to create a socialist society, a blanket socialist society, right? 6 years out of 7, it's as capitalist a society as it wants to be. But the 7th year is a reset. I think we didn't talk about this in Torah study when we studied Parashat Re'eh, but one of the more interesting things, I think the debt forgiveness hits us as contemporary Americans as like the vastly more unrealistic piece. But we actually know historically that periodic debt annulments was a part of ancient history, particularly ancient Babylon and Sumeria, was often done by a new king on the instance of his coronation. And like somehow society functioned. And, what Torah is doing is making it not the whim of a particular king, a particular earthly king, but building it into the cycle of community life. Sophia and then Rebecca.
I find it really interesting that the Deuteronomy text is the only one that deliberately imposes a disadvantage on the privileged, because the rules about, you can only harvest from the land, that is an equalizer and it's a huge social upset. But the people who have been able to really grow and prepare and store crops up for this year and are going to be more comfortable are the landowners anyway. The people who are having to forage, and what they're eating next is dependent on what is coming out of the ground in this moment, are going to be the disadvantaged. But the debt forgiveness is different in that it really only advantages those who are less privileged. You know, the landowners can't really save up in quite as much of a way against the debt forgiveness.
That's a great acknowledgement. And if we get into the weeds of the halacha, of the laws around the seventh year, Sophia is right. There is no prohibition on hoarding the produce of the sixth year in advance of the seventh year, right? So we're going into a Shmita right now, and to use like a very concrete example, if Shmita applied outside of the land of Israel, right now in Oregon, all the fruit trees are ripe, right? So my family and I go around foraging and in our own backyard, and we have been putting up so much jam, and we are dehydrating so many pears. And when it's apple season, we'll make applesauce. Well, actually, this is the thing. We are putting up so much jam. It was strawberry season, and there's like a bunch of strawberry jam we have put up, and a bunch of frozen strawberries, and then a bunch of frozen blueberries. And now we're doing blackberry jam and pear jam and peach jam and freezing those. And we can keep that through the Shmita year and not share that with anybody. I mean, we like to share it, so we'll share it. But in terms of the halacha of Shmita, if we were living in the land of Israel and this is where it was happening, it would be kosher for us to keep all of those jars of jam to ourselves and not share it. That's produce of the sixth year. But once we get into apple season after Rosh Hashanah, I can still keep my applesauce if I have any left that I canned last year and not share it with anybody. But I've got to make sure that the apples are all distributed out. And I can't hoard enough in my house to be making applesauce and keeping applesauce after there's no longer apples in the field. So Sophia is right. There is a certain amount of the more privilege I have in general, the more land I have or have access to, the more stockpiling I can do in advance of the Shmita year, though it still certainly benefits everyone else to have access. Okay, I see so many hands, but Rebecca and Howard, and then I think we'll move on. Go ahead, Rebecca. But you are muted.
Thank you. I said mine's pretty quick. I think about some of the debt forgiveness, that is happening now, right? And the impacts of that, right? In some of the historically Black colleges. Let me just think about that. And I think about then what happens with the possibility of not being burdened with that debt, and thinking of Philip's kind of leveling the playing field, and it kind of brings that back into balance. What happens to the people who did have the debt that no longer have the debt? Who can they now become, right? And how can they contribute differently? And so it's not only a financial, that financial kind of leveling, but I think it's also kind of the changing the community contributions to the community leveling and growth too. So,
right. So many people not living their fully actualized lives because of the burden of debt. A great point. And we have a comment in the chat about how this, prevents monopolies from taking root. No one can fully accrue that much power. Howard, you wanted to say something?
Isn't it in Deuteronomy where it says that you can eat of your own field?
Yes.
Okay, so here we have.
No, I'm sorry, it is not, because Deuteronomy isn't talking about produce. It's Leviticus that says you can eat of your own. It's confusing. It says you cannot harvest from your own field, but you can eat of your own field.
Yeah. Okay, so that kind of allows for some wiggle room for folks who have big fields and want to eat of it. The other thing is that all of a sudden it reminded me of in Egypt, where before the famine, they were told to store up their food for the year. Wasn't it the year? and not touch their food for a year because they were going to be without on the next year? I don't know what
There were
year.
7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph organized a massive collection of a fifth of the output to storehouse for the years of famine.
Right. Okay.
Interestingly, we see in Genesis that they didn't redistribute that, though.
No, right.
They sold it back to the Egyptian people. Joseph managed the sale of it back to the Egyptian people, and which created a huge transfer of wealth, as the Egyptian people had to first give all their money and then all their flocks and then all their land to Pharaoh. And essentially, this is an origin story for how the Egyptian people became serfs on their own land. And some contemporary commentators notice it as an implicit critique that this, an entire enslaved population then became willing to enslave the descendants of Joseph, when in fact it was the grain that the people themselves had grown and arguably should have had a right to have it freely distributed back to them. Ellen.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you can harvest from your land but not eat of it. I don't get that.
Yes, great. That's such a good question to segue into our next sources. I'm so glad you asked. Let's take a look. Because the sages and the halachists want to figure out, well, what's the distinction? What does this mean? So, Ellen, would you be willing to read the Rashi commentary on these verses?
Oh, yes. What you can put in your pocket.
Sure. Do not harvest crops that grow on their own with the intention of taking possession and ownership of it like other harvests. Rather, it shall be hefker, ownerless, for all to take freely. And the produce of the Shabbat of the land shall be yours to eat. Although I have prohibited the produce of the Shmita year to you, I did not prohibit you from eating it or deriving benefit from it, only that you should not treat it as its owner. Rather, all should have equal rights to the produce of the 7th year, you, your hired worker, and those who reside with you.
So do you feel that answers your question, Ellen?
Yeah, I have to think about it.
Okay.
I'll have to look at it later.
I again, you'll excuse my repeated use of the metaphors of the abundance of fruit in Eugene at this time of year, but I imagine the way I freely relate to the fruit growing on the fig tree in my yard versus the way I will relate to a pear tree that is hanging over the sidewalk on someone else's property, which is not, I confess, as simple as I pick my figs and I don't pick their pears. No, I pick their pears when I'm walking by. I pick a pear that's hanging off over the sidewalk, especially if it's a really abundant tree. But I don't take a sack and harvest as many pears as I can take into that sack. But I might, every time I walk past that house, while the pears are ripe, pick one pear and nosh on it. And so I think the distinction between you may not harvest, but you may eat, is that you may not take possession of the entire harvest. You may graze from it as anyone who is not the owner of it does.
Yes, I see it. Thank you.
Awesome. And okay, so let's go even more into the weeds. By the way, this asterisk, I'll just scroll all the way down so you can see it. I'm just giving credit to the Chazon Shmita source book, which is a much more comprehensive set of resources for thinking about Shmita. Many, but not all of tonight's sources are taken from there. All right. So would someone else be willing to read Maimonides' Laws of Shmita and Yovel. And you see, he has an entire book of halacha, of Jewish law, called Hilchot Shmita v'Yovel, the laws of Shmita and Jubilee. And we're just taking two very brief excerpts from this.
I'll read.
Go ahead, Tom.
It is a commandment to divest oneself from everything that the land produces in the seventh year. As Exodus 23:11 states, in the seventh year, you shall leave it untended and unharvested. Anyone who locks their vineyard or fences off their agricultural field in the sabbatical year has nullified a positive commandment. This also holds true if they gathered all of their produce into their home. Instead, they should leave everything ownerless, hefker. Thus, everyone, rich and poor, have equal rights in every place, as Exodus 23:11 states, and the poor of your people shall partake of it. One may only bring a small amount of produce into one's home, just as one brings from ownerless property.
And let's just go on. Thank you, Tom.
May I continue?
Yes, you may. Absolutely.
We may only partake of the produce of the sabbatical year as long as that species is still found growing in the field. This is derived from Leviticus 25:7. For the animal and the beast in your land will be all the produce to eat.
The for is just in a strange place in that sentence.
Yeah.
All the produce to eat will be for the animal and the beast in your land.
Okay, thank you. This implies that as long as a wild animal can be eating from the species in the field, one may eat from what he has collected at home. When there is no longer any of that species for the beast to eat in the field, one is obligated to remove that species from his home.
Oh, wow.
And make it available to the public. There goes your
Of the
strawberry.
seventh year, right? That's my applesauce, but not my pear jam.
Hold it. Is that from the last year? No.
Right. No, this year. Any produce from this year, once it's no longer available in the field, you can't have it stored in your home.
From the Shmita year.
From the Shmita year.
Oh, okay.
So, sorry, Tom, you were saying something and I interrupted.
Oh, I said, there goes your strawberry jam.
Well, there goes next year's strawberry jam.
Yeah.
This year's strawberry jam I can still keep. But yeah, exactly. So I hope this satisfies some of our misgiving around the question of how exclusive is the access. It seems to me that these texts are being fairly expansive about just anybody around. Like you are truly ownerless. This land is truly ownerless, meaning you don't get to dictate who has access to it. Which I imagine if we stop and think about that for a minute, may raise certain ambivalences. So I'm going to break us into breakout rooms again briefly for you to just muse on the implications that these texts have for the very notion of property control. How is this inspiring? How is this challenging? Because when we come back from this, we can, if folks want to share a few insights, they can, but we will get into the nitty-gritty of how this gets very difficult to actualize. We've been talking about how inspiring it is, and and we can do this, but let's talk both about how it's inspiring and how it's challenging. I'm going to scramble. Does it sound good if I scramble our breakout rooms and you can get to know somebody else?
Yeah.
And scramble away.
All right.
Yes, scramble, please.
Okay. Opening all rooms. And one of you is going to have 3. Well, maybe not. Welcome back, friends. So, again, apologies to those who were cut off mid-sentence, and feel free to use the private chat to remedy that to the extent possible. And if anyone would like to share any insight or challenge that you had about this, or inspiration, let's take a couple. I'll take up to 5, and then we're going to move on. Yes, Debbie.
Yeah, I was impressed by the difference in abundance in Eugene as opposed to trying to grow things at 4,000 feet in Northeast Oregon, where I live, and wondering about equity and addressing the differences in where people live in that, and abundance or lack of.
Yes, great point. Shmita would seem to be an easier to actualize thing in a place where you could trust that you would actually have enough stockpiled from the 6th year and years prior to be so open-handed and open-fielded the 7th year. Jade, go ahead.
So I had a little farm I was working on at the beginning of spring on Eagle's Rest, which unfortunately didn't work because of the water sprinkler broke. But anyway, the woman there let the sheep and the chickens out in the spring, which would be the spring of the Shmita year, and they destroyed the perennials even. I think about that verse about leaving the animals into the field to eat, and that's what we can eat. Oh my gosh, there's going to be no harvest in the fall from any of those crops because they ruined them. I just wanted to say.
Great. This does come up every time we discuss Shmita. That for human purposes, what is being described really would wreak havoc on the agricultural fields.
So what were they talking about then?
Yeah, it's a good question. Chris?
Yeah, we were talking about how aspirational this is. And, it's certainly a goal to shoot for, it's that no one has any possessions and we don't own the land and we have more at one with it. But it's really hard, And, I was telling Ellen, I think it was, that one of the meditations for the Shofar project last week talked about how countercultural this would be to go against commerce, to go against money, and then related it to, just Shabbat is countercultural, and even the meditation itself, someone out there in the middle of the day is making money and we are not, and we're just doing this. And I just thought that was beautiful. I was been thinking about that a lot, because it's something to aim for and to shoot for and to think about whether or not it could actually work with the farms and the land and, the agriculture. That to me is almost beside the point. It's something to put there in your head to think about it.
That's such a beautiful framing. Thank you for sharing that. I think, it really touches on such a deep question of how much control are we willing to relinquish? How much optimization are we willing to let go of? Are we willing to give up? And when we think about it in economically beneficial terms, it's much easier, right? I would posit that most of us are willing to let ourselves sleep at least a few hours every night, even though hypothetically on any given night, maybe we could use those hours to get more work done or earn more money or can more pear jam or whatever. But we generally make a practice of letting ourselves sleep to optimize, or among other reasons, to optimize our functioning during the hours that we're awake. And I think many people who have a Shabbat practice, to the extent that they have a Shabbat practice, also think about it in terms of, I take a day off and I shake up my rhythm to optimize how I work during the week. I think the thing that's so radical about Shmita is that when you talk about taking this long a time, it's not going to optimize anything. It is just about the practice of relinquishing control.
That's optimizing something.
Which, right, might be optimizing something, but not optimizing something that we can
Worldly,
quantify
yeah.
in an economically
Yes.
driven framework. Yes,
Yeah.
very much. Oh,
And
you
I have-
might have just given me the hook that I was looking for my sermon. Thank you, Chris.
And I have to say this thing about remittance in is it Deuteronomy?
Yes.
Remittance in our economically charged world, that is still used. It's called bankruptcy, and it's used by people so that they can hold on to their money, not so that they can give up their money, but so that they can hold on. It's used in the flip.
Well, personal bankruptcy is used to be able to, but it has gotten a lot harder in recent decades for individuals who.
But not for corporations.
Right. It has gotten easier for corporations and harder for individuals. You know, I was recently, I think possibly in the course of preparing this class, I was researching Rolling Jubilee, which is a project I used to donate to back in like early 2010s, which was buying up debt for pennies on the dollar and forgiving it. And I was just researching like kind of what happened to it and how does, is there still a mechanism nowadays for buying debt to forgive it? And one thing I ran across was a critique of Rolling Jubilee that said, actually, that debt that is so cheap to buy and have forgiven is so cheap because it's not actionable anymore. And this is a little known fact. Almost every state in the US has a statute of limitations on debt, which is in almost every state in the US less than 7 years. Meaning if a debt has defaulted, and depending on the state, the company, the credit card company or the hospital or Sally Mae or whoever, Navient, whoever it is, hasn't initiated a lawsuit, they only have something like, depending on the state, it ranges from 3 years to 5 years to 6 years to initiate a lawsuit to collect the debt from the last payment, from the point that the debt defaulted. And so it doesn't prevent collections from hassling the person for longer, but the debt is not actually actionable. It is legally forgiven. Doesn't prevent your credit score from being bad. And it's an interesting fact. I think pointing to the point you made, Howard, which is that debt remittance is actually more common legally than we think of it when we look at this and say like, wow, how could they do that? And very difficult. So let's look at the next source. And some of us looked at this a few weeks ago in Torah study. So those of you who are regulars in Torah study, forgive me for the repetition.
Oh, Prose Bowl.
Yeah. The Prose Bowl.
The Prose Bowl. The Pro Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I will read this document just because it might need some editorializing to explain. Hillel the Elder. This is the famous Rabbi Hillel of "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" It's the famous Rabbi Hillel who met the convert who wanted to learn the Torah standing on one foot and said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." The rest is commentary. Go and study it. This Hillel the Elder instituted a prose bowl, which means a document that prevents the sabbatical year from annulling an outstanding debt. It prevents the Shmita from shmiting. And we learned in this Mishnah, if one writes a prose bowl, the Shmita does not annul debt. This is one of the matters that Hillel the Elder instituted because he saw that the people of the nation were refraining from lending to one another and therefore violating a Torah mitzvah, which is from Deuteronomy 15:9, just a few verses after the excerpt that we read. Beware lest there be a base thought in your heart, saying, The 7th year, the Shmita year, is at hand, and your eye is evil against your needy kin person. So Hillel arose and instituted the prose bull to ensure that the people would give loans. And what is the prose bull? This is the essence of the prose bull. This document transfers the debt from being held by an individual to being held by a Beit Din. Turns out, in Jewish law, a corporation has different responsibilities and privileges than an individual. Individuals have to relinquish debt during the Shemitah year, but apparently the Beit Din, the court, does not. And therefore, essentially, the person transfers the debt to the Beit Din, and the Beit Din authorizes the individual who was holding the debt to collect the debt on their behalf and pays them for collecting the debt. So this is one of those very aspiration hits reality moments. And I invite you to just react if you would like.
So clever. It's so clever.
I just have a question.
Yes.
What is a prose bowl? I've never heard that word before.
So it's a either Mishnaic Hebrew or Aramaic word for document. So literally it's a legal document.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So he's instituting a legal fix. Hillel, by the way, it's not as famous as his if I were not for myself, who will be for me comment, but there are many stories in the Mishnah about how poor he was. So Hillel is not doing this out of sympathy or, out of, class solidarity with wealthy people. Hillel is doing this as someone who knows poverty and is poor and is very concerned that poor people are not being able to access capital.
It's very clever. It's very, very clever.
Jade wrote in the chat, this feels like a bubble bursting, so disappointed in the dream lost. And I'm inclined to agree with Jade. It feels super disappointing to not work a little harder to see if there's ways to make the Shemitah year really work. And I think that that beckons to or harkens back to what Ron was talking about in our last chat group or pair, where these are reminders that this isn't really our land, that this isn't really ours, this is Hashem's. And I don't know, it all feels messy to me that Hillel instituted this.
Yes. So. And I think about this particularly in this moment where there's been so much so much trouble around extending eviction moratoria. And so and I think that issue can help us understand the problem of the creditor in the Shmita framework, as well as the problem of the debtor. And, what could the role of the Beit Din have been? Why couldn't the Beit Din have insured the debt and paid back the creditor if you needed to make sure the creditor was paid back? It's it is, I wonder about the other potential imaginations of how we could have fixed this problem besides just making it go away. Yes, Lizzie.
It feels really problematic to me in the sense that I understand from Hillel's point of view, it's making kind of a reason for people to still give loans to the needy. So I understand that feels like a solution, but it really reminds me of all the terrible cash advance and check advance services we have here, and just super high interest loans where you're kind of taking advantage of people who need a loan quickly in that then they're exempt from this debt forgiveness essentially, because the Beit Din doesn't have to relinquish that.
Yes. Although let's remember one of the distinctions between legal Jewish loans and contemporary loans, they are all interest free, which is its own challenge.
Yeah.
And also this is meant for the close to the sabbatical year. So like in the last year, you've been loaning, I'm the guy with all the money, and I've been loaning money out the first year, the second year, the third year, the fourth year, the fifth year, knowing I'm going to get it back. I got plenty of time. And now it's 6 months before the Shmita year. It's 3 months before the Shmita year. And I say, well, I don't want to loan this person. I'm not getting an interest, but I would like to get my money back so I can buy my seed for my crop. And I know I may not get it back 3 months from now, the Shmita year. I have to give it up. And so for those who have that concern, and I would say not everybody would even probably have that concern. It's for those who have that concern, they can loan with some, for those who are not saintly yet, willing to give up their money freely without any questions, they still have their money in circulation. So I don't know. It seems pretty. It's a segment that seems to be addressed quite cleverly.
Mm-hmm. It all depends on how altruistic we're willing to assume Hillel was experiencing the wealthy of his time. And yes, it could have been that reality was as you're describing, Howard, and that most debt was forgiven during the Shmita year, or, most debt was paid off by the Shmita year because it wasn't so terribly onerous, because it was interest free, as Torah also requires in the same chapter in Deuteronomy. We also, one of the other protections that also comes in a 7-year cycle, although not queued to the Shmita year, is that anyone who becomes an indentured servant is only in servitude for a period of 7 years, and then they're set free. And the greatest, indeed, the only reason an Israelite would become an indentured servant to another Israelite is if they were stuck in poverty and went into debt and needed to sell themselves or a family member to pay it off. Hillel's change does not allow interest. And to this day, halachically, Jews are not allowed to charge interest to other Jews, which actually makes the question of how can Jews own stock, in a bank, for example, that might have mortgages charged to other Jews, a really interesting halachic question, which my husband is in the process of writing a book about. I think I mentioned this to some of you. Yes, Philip.
Does anybody in Israel today forgive debt?
First of all, there are Hebrew free loan societies all over the world, including a large one in Israel. There is not, as far as I know, a whole lot of interest-free banking in the Jewish world. There's a very interesting, so every religion, I believe, prohibits usury between its own adherents, including Christianity and including Islam. And the Muslim world, Islamic banking is a really interesting phenomenon. And I think capitalism could learn a lot from Islamic banking, because the way it gets around the prohibition on charging interest is by making all, I'm overly simplifying this, but as a generalization, all transactions, all loans are not actually loans, but partnerships. And what that does is it means that in Islamic banking, risk and reward are shared in a different way than in Western banking. So for example, a mortgage in Islamic banking looks really different. You will never pay an entire mortgage and then have your house repossessed and get no money back, because your house is a co-investment with the Islamic bank. And to the extent that the investment fails, it fails both partners. So there's interesting books about Islamic banking, and I'm at risk of perhaps already having exceeded my my knowledge of this, but I believe the Islamic world is where this principle is enacted more than anywhere else right now. Yes. Someone's writing in this chat that Shtisel on Netflix has so it's they have a gamach for heaters, and a gamach is an acronym meaning Gimilut Chasadim Society. It's a loving kindness society, which is a whole other phenomenon in tight Jewish communities around donating objects. There's gamachim for wedding dresses, for all sorts of things to distribute among people who can't afford to buy their own. Okay, great. So let's just hold the knowledge of the Prose Bowl and the ways that brings us into kind of the messy, yucky reality of just how people don't like to part with their control or expectations of getting their investments back, getting their loans repaid. And we're going to transition to some contemporary thinkers and sort of the utopian ideas they had about Shmita now, and sort of compare and ask the question, how can these ideas be in conversation with what we saw already? So Rav Kook, chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine before the state of Israel existed, really interesting character. He was a vegetarian. He thought that eventually all Jews would realize we needed to stop eating meat. He was really into reconciling between the religious and the secular Zionists, really interesting guy. And he wrote a book about Shmita, Shabbat Haaretz. So let's read an excerpt of what his aspiration was for Shmita. Would someone who hasn't read already like to read?
Sure. What the Sabbath achieves regarding the individual, the Shmita achieves with regard to the nation as a whole. A year of solemn rest is essential for both the nation and the land, a year of peace and quiet without oppressor and tyrant. It is a year of equality and rest in which the soul reaches out toward divine justice, towards God who sustains the living creatures with loving kindness. There is no private property and no punctilious privilege, but the peace of God reigns over all, in which there is the breath of life. Sanctity is not profaned by the exercise of private acquisitiveness over all the year's produce and the covetousness of wealth stirred up by the commerce is forgotten for food, but not for commerce. There were some words in there.
He didn't write this in English, so we can't blame him. I don't know who the translator was.
Okay.
Thanks for taking that on, Rebecca.
You betcha.
Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher's translator was a little less pompous, so if someone's willing to take on this text, it should be a little easier.
I can do this one.
Thanks, Sophia.
The Shmita year teaches us further that the rich should not lord it over the poor. Accordingly, the Torah ordains that all should be equal during the 7th year, both the rich and the needy having access to the gardens and fields to eat their fill. Yet another reason for Shmita, in order that they should not always be preoccupied with working the soil to provide for their material needs. For in this 1 year, they would be completely free. The liberation from the yoke of work would give them the opportunity for studying Torah and wisdom. Those who are not students will be occupied with crafts and building and supplying these needs in Eretz Israel. Those endowed with special skills will invent new methods in this free time for the benefit of the world.
Thanks for reading, Sophia. And this really calls back to someone made the comment, maybe it was Rebecca, about the ways that debt sort of crushes people's creativity, or their narrows their options for expression and exploration and vocation in the world. And Rav Kalisher is clearly picking up on that and saying, like, free people from debt for a year and see what creativity could flourish. Free people from the grind. So I deliberately put those two texts on the same page as the description of the Prose Bowl, because it's so fascinating that Shmita among serious thinkers inspires both this this creates a problem that we need to fix, let's make it go away, as well as these really utopian aspirations. And I wondered if anyone wanted to reflect on what that comparison brings up for you.
I can only comment on one side of it. It's like retirement. I have a lot more time than I used to have. And along with that goes a fair bit of responsibility. How do I want to use that time? Am I willing to use my energy on behalf of other people or not? Just be like the mugwump bird.
Like the what?
It's my father's. The mugwump bird. It's a bird that sits on a fence with its mug on one side and its wump on the other. Just not doing anything creatively useful to anyone.
But I think there is this, the one critique I would have of Rav Kalisher's description of Shmita is that it does move again into that optimization framework of let's do this because people will invent things and people will build things and people will learn more Torah and it will be productive for us. And just noticing this way in which, we can embrace it as long as we can articulate how it will optimize something.
Produce.
And, is there some value to time that is really just rest, even if we don't, come back better, stronger, faster? Ellen, I see you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, and I really do believe there is, even though I personally am not very good at taking advantage of that opportunity. So I think they're the readings or whatever that focus on property, that's the value of that society. And the readings that focus on maybe something more spiritual or an actual eschewing of property, that's the value of that society. That is, well, why are we alive? What's the point?
And the great challenge of being Jewish is that these are the values of our society, right? We're not an ascetic society.
Right.
Such a great way of framing it, Ellen, as if it's two different societies, but we're talking about the same society. And our imaginations of Shmita are kind of butting up against the fact that we're not an easy to pin down society. We're a society that does care about, the Hebrew phrase is yeshuv haaretz, developing the land and building wealth and optimizing things. And we're a society with spiritual aspirations and social aspirations for equity and time for everyone to contemplate the divine. And those are, difficult realities to hold in one society.
Yeah, I think they are difficult for all people who are interested in spiritual matters. But that, I mean, if the Sabbath is that important, if the Sabbath of stopping work, of pulling back, of drawing in is not, if that's important, then it has to be related to the Shmita year. How important is that? I mean, you have 365 times, in some ways, more important, and how difficult that is. But of course, we look at it from, and I would also guess, and I'm certainly, this is just a guess from me, that if someone were really devout and followed the mitzvah, the 613 mitzvahs a guy and whatever else it is, and did it wholeheartedly, this would not be out of place to be asked to do these things. Because I would think, my imagination tells me that your heart would be in the right place for this anyway. It wouldn't mean that it wouldn't present difficulties, but you'd be facing the right direction already. This would be actually a year of renewal, not a burden.
Many devoutly religious people are willing to, live at different material standards of living as part of their religious practice. And in this source sheet, I include a quote from Rabbi Jeremy Benstein's article, Stop the Machine, which if you Google it, he has this comment about a society that is willing to keep Shmita, to the extent that exists, is a society that is willing to collectively significantly lower their material standard of living for a year. And I think I think as we consider the utopian aspiration of Shmita, you also have to hold that reality. Yes, it means no applesauce after December. Whatever. I mean, maybe you don't care about applesauce, but all the things, right? And, it's a society that is willing to significantly take a hit in its material standard of living collectively for the sake of a spiritual aspiration.
And if you did that every 7 years,
mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be like it's in our imagination. In our imagination, this is it's just so out of line, the way it's just so, left field. But if this were done every 7 years, at some point, if one hadn't already, you wouldn't go back and buy a new house that's really big and cram it full of stuff, knowing that in 6 years you were going to be relinquishing everything again. You would naturally live in a cycle that's much different. This is why it's very hard for us. Very hard for us.
Right. And I think it is
to understand.
It's hard for us to understand. And we didn't go in, well, I did go into those texts last week, that how Rashi posited that the ancient Israelites before the first exile never did this. And that the first exile was a punishment for them never doing it. And, and then Hillel's Prose Bowl is positing that at least some people in the second temple period were following the letter of the law, sort of, but violating the spirit by just refusing to give loans. So it seems to be, I think you're right, Howard, a society that could figure out how to get on board might be very transformed. And yet our society has not figured out how to get on board. And, and nowadays in contemporary Israel, and Shmita only applies in the land of Israel, as I've mentioned, there are some very interesting both loopholes and applications. between last week and this week, I started researching a little bit the Otsar Beit Din. It's another way that corporations come in, although not in the like capitalistic sense. Otsar Beit Din literally means the storehouse, the treasure house of the Beit Din. So what to do about the fact that like a lot of farmers actually don't have very high profit margins and can't go a year without any wage. So there's this whole system that has been figured out in some communities in Israel that the Beit Din doesn't buy the produce because the Shemitah year produce is free, right? But the Beit Din will pay the owner of the land, will pay the farmer a wage to manage the distribution of the produce. And this gets back to Debbie. She's not here anymore, but Debbie's question about, well, what about in the highlands where the soil is bad and nobody has access to good fruit? So pays the farmer to manage the distribution of the produce across the country so that it will get eaten before the time that it's no longer good in the field. And consumers do have to pay a price for the produce because they are paying a fee for the farmers' work and the transporters and the packers and the pickers. However, they are not paying for the fruit, and the price of Shemitah year produce is noticeably lower because consumers are only paying for the labor and no one is earning a profit. And that, you know, like when I hear about things like that, it's like, okay, that's getting closer. That's getting closer to a workable Shemitah that is both within the letter and spirit.
This would be up Hillel's alley. This would be up Hillel's alley. But they do have workers during the Shemitah year. I guess aliens.
Well, no, they have Israelite workers, people who choose to earn the wage picking the fruit.
During the Shemitah year.
Shemitah doesn't prohibit people from earning a wage, from working to earn a wage.
Oh, I thought you can't work either.
Your debts are forgiven.
Oh.
So it's like taking thousands of years, but like the creative energy of the Israelite people like is continuing to chip at figuring out like how does this happen? Jade.
I have a question. You mentioned before that hiring someone else to work the land was part of the answer. Did I hear that right?
That is part of the fix in contemporary Israel in one of the many ways of dealing with Shemitah.
Right. How do they explain away the resting of the land? Because it's not resting the land no matter who works it. It's not a resting of people.
Not working, just the picking of the produce and not picking it for a harvest that any one person gets to keep and profit from, but picking to get it distributed across the land of Israel.
I see. Thank you for clarifying.
So it's all, it's all very nuanced.
Very.
Oh, friends, I could just keep discussing this so much longer, and God willing, we will next week. We didn't get to the last page. However, that's okay because the last page was around some of the spiritual implications. What does it mean for us as American Jews who are not obligated in Shemitah because of where we live? And, many of us maybe don't even consider ourselves obligated in halacha anyway. What does it do for us spiritually to be studying this, to be contemplating the idea of Shemitah? How does it inspire us? Or how could it inspire us? And those are the questions we're really going to go into next week. So thank you all for joining me tonight. It's such a joy to have this robust and thoughtful group of people studying together. And I hope to see you again next week for part 3.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Rabbi.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.